I told Jeff I'm a little nervous tonight, so hopefully I won't lose my place, but we're all friends here, right? So you won't laugh too loud at me or make fun of me behind my back. So, the name of our chapter this week, and I thought about telling Jeff, chapter 4, I did chapter 5, but I didn't do that. Our chapter 4 is called Spiritual Formation for Missional Churches. And when I read that title, I thought, okay, what does that mean? So I got to thinking about what does it mean to be spiritual? What about this idea of being spiritual? So the first thing when you're presented with a question like that is you go to Webster's Dictionary and you look up to see what does the dictionary say the definition of spiritual is. And that did not help me at all. It gave me some things like having to do with the spiritual life. So that really didn't help a whole lot. And then I thought, I can think about myself. What do I think that it means to be spiritual or to have a spiritual life? So I thought about it, and I thought, okay, that I'm sure that involves praying and reading your Bible and understanding the doctrines of the Bible and following the commands that God gives us in the Bible, and it would have to do with having a spiritual life. And then I thought to myself, do I consider myself spiritual? And I had to say, no, I don't. Going by that definition, no, I don't consider myself really a real spiritual person. And then I thought, let's see what the book has to say about it. At first, the ideas that Hugh presents as he understood what a spiritual life was that they were so far removed from his real life. And he gave examples of when he was in seminary and how he just wasn't connecting with what was going on. And so that he really thought that he was kind of missing the mark on being a spiritual person. So he talked a little bit in his book about what, if we could choose to be in a spiritual life, what kind of things would that be? And so I came up with maybe some want ads of what you would need to do or don't do if you're in the spiritual life. And so the first want ad would be, wanted, are you looking for a life filled with burdens, constant study, no joy, and your compensation will be loads of guilt and self-loathing? How many of you want that job? Or is the job that we're looking for, are you looking for an exciting life? It's rewarding, joyful, active, with a compensation of being connected with other people and with Jesus. I know that's the one that I would want to choose. He talked a little bit about some frustrations that people have with spirituality or in their church. And, just a few of them, this was on page 92 of your book, and a few of them that you could just pick out was that not only were the people frustrated, but the pastors of the church were also frustrated, and that they were finding out that, most of the people in their church were Pharisees. They didn't act like they believed what Jesus believed, and they didn't act like he acted. He said that that people didn't want to seem to get out of their small groups and to get beyond the Bible studies. And then some of the people in the church, too, were also frustrated. And they came up kind of with the same things. It's guilt-driven. It's a duty. It's always about church attendance, Bible study, worship, prayer. And it didn't really have anything to do with their normal life. So I think what we need to do is we need to change our perception of what spirituality is. Because if you go by all these definitions and the frustrations of it, nobody would want to have a spiritual life. So just a few things that we could think about in changing our perception of spirituality is instead of thinking about all these negative things, let's think about it as being a disciple. And if you think about the disciples in the New Testament, they were just regular people. And they were struggling, they had problems, and they were trying to live a heartfelt life. And in doing that, they wanted to be obedient to the Father. And also, they were willing to live and die for the higher purpose of God's kingdom. So if you think about trying to be a disciple, that's one way to look at a spiritual life. And then the one that I really liked was an apprentice, being apprenticed. And I could get a real good mental picture of this as, maybe someone was going to be a carpenter. And so they go in as an apprentice. And first of all, they start out just observing, watching what the master carpenter was doing. And then pretty soon, the master carpenter would say, "Here, I want you to hammer these nails for me." And then maybe a little bit later it was, "Well, let's draw out a diagram of what we want to do." And then maybe, a little bit later, who knows, a few months down the road, it could have been years down the road, he would say, "Let's just make this little table." And then as time went on, this apprentice was going to graduate into someone that could produce just beautiful, beautiful furniture. And so isn't that something that you would want to be too, an apprentice of Jesus? And in the book, he kind of takes you through how it just starts out, God just asking you to do just a few little things. First of all, we're that observer, and then we do a few things here, and pretty soon we are the carpenter, or we're the no longer the apprentice, but we're learning more and more and taking ownership of it ourselves. And then we also have our example of Jesus himself. And this is kind of where they went into this DNA, they described it as. And they had 3 circles that were all intersecting. And they named each one of them. And I may not be such a great drawer there. But first of all, they had community. And the community has to do with a social, your social, where you feel like you fit in. Maybe you're in a church group with a lot of different people that are so unlike you, but still you feel like you belong. And so that's the community. And then there's the mission. Now, the mission has to do with caring for the poor and maybe some people that are just a little bit marginal. It also is doing acts in the world and also caring for the people that God cares about, that have the heart of God. And then the last one is communion. Now, communion is probably the one that we all identify with most. And that is the activities that relate to our connection to God. And then once again, here is the Bible study and the prayer time and maybe our small groups that we're with. And it's that time where you're spending communing with God. Now, he also talked about there were 3 blunders that a lot of churches make when they're kind of going into this spiritual formation. And the first one was not having any process at all. That people would just believe that it would just happen, that you would just graduate from one thing into another, that just being in with a group, you were going to get more spiritual. And then he talked about how that, it's really a dogfight going into this. You have an air warfare and you have a ground warfare. And your air warfare is the things that we hear and the things that we read and the things that we see and that are shown to us. But then the ground warfare is when you get into the trenches and you're actually doing things. So you have to make sure that you have a process. What are you going to do to get from one thing to another? Another blunder is if you have a lopsided approach, and that would be if any one of these three circles gets larger than the other one. And I mentioned that a lot of us kind of probably communion is where we feel like we're more advanced in our spiritual walk. But one of the problems with that is if that's all we focus on, if all we focus on is praying and reading our Bible and researching, we could tend to become a Pharisee. And we would start thinking that we were better than other people because we have more of that head knowledge. But the other two things, if you get them out of focus too, they also cause problems. If we are really focused all on missions and all we are doing is taking care of people, then we just are like a social worker. And if we focus too much on community, then it may be the only thing that we end up with is having a reputation for giving great parties. So we need to make sure that we keep all these things in balance. And then the third blunder is that we need to minimize the barriers between there so that we have all of them and not just one or two. So the key to the healthy spiritual formation is balance. Now that was kind of the introduction to this chapter, and I was anxious to get into the next part of it. You know, how do we do this? Kind of the how-to of it. How do we change from what we talked about last week of being a consumerism church into a missional church? And how do we move people on in their spiritual formation or their spiritual walk? How do we become disciples or apprentices of Jesus? You know, and when I was reading that, I thought, okay, now this part is just right up my alley because I'm pretty organized, and I love step-by-step directions. I love to make lists and mark things off the list as I do them. And so I thought, okay, I can do this. And then another thing that I love to do is I love to do crafts. And so then I was thinking, I have this great idea. We can all do crafts tonight. We can cut out circles, and we could glue them on ribbon, and we could write on them, and we could put a cross at the top, and it would say spiritual formation on it, and we'd have a bookmark that we could put in our Bibles. Are y'all with me on that one? Well, then I thought, no, I probably shouldn't do that. So we're just going to write down kind of the steps. The first step is observation, and the first step is kind of like dating. This is where you're getting to know the person. You're finding out their likes and their dislikes. What do you have in common? What do you not have in common? The things that you don't have in common, can you live with that? Just kind of like dating. Are you attracted to similar values, convictions, rhythms of life, same kind of worship, same kind of things that you'd like to be on mission for? Another thing about observation time is that it takes time. Sometimes the longer it takes for someone to make a decision if they want to be on mission with you or not, the better it is. Because if you have people that jump in right away and say, yes, I want to do this, they kind of sometimes tend to be the ones that fall away and they don't follow through with it. And then we need to have the freedom to observe other people and to observe what's going on and to find out if this is the mission that we want to be on with someone. And I love the examples that he gave about Jesus. He talked about Nicodemus coming to Jesus and how you could tell that Nicodemus had already been observing Jesus. Before he made even the attempt to talk to Jesus, he had been observing Jesus. And then he also talked about Zacchaeus and how Zacchaeus was also observing Jesus and finding out, he had heard a lot about him, but finding out if this was someone that he wanted to identify with. Well, people need to hear our stories too. We need to talk to them and tell them what God has done for us. What has God laid on our heart? What kind of miracles has God been doing in our lives? So we also need to hear what their stories are. And that takes time too. We need to listen to people and find out what's going on in their lives. How can we minister to them? What are their struggles that they're going through? And he said, and I thought this was a really good point, he said, to use this opportunity to find out what needs reformed, reignited, counseled, or trained. So as leaders, that's us. We have got to do that. We have got to take time with people during that observation phase. And then, between everything, and I forgot to make my circle here. So that was the observation. Then there has to be a transition to the next step. And in this transition, he called it a calling out. And you can read about this on page 109. But during this calling out, you have to acknowledge what gifts you do have. You know what those gifts are because you took the time to find out about that person. And then you need to give them some ideas of how they can use those gifts. You need to call out everyone to something bigger and better. They need to die to themselves and start to live for the kingdom. Jesus' examples were, he asked the disciples that were fishermen to leave their nets and come with him. That was the calling out. He also, he said, take up your cross and follow me. That was a calling out. He said, seek first the kingdom of God. And that was a calling out. Now, I have a personal example of this. When I was in my mid-20s, our church started a new program called Awana. And I don't know if any of you know what that is or not. But our church started this new program. And up to that time, I had maybe filled in on the nursery, and I had maybe taught a Sunday school class, but I wasn't real involved in the church. I was there every Sunday. I read my Bible. I came on Wednesday nights and I prayed, but I wasn't real involved or plugged into the church. And our associate pastor and his wife came to me and they said, Janet, we want you to be the director of the Chums group. And I thought, the director of the Chums group? I mean, that means I'm over all of it. I'm in charge of all of it. I would have to prepare every lesson every week. I would have to encourage these young girls in their walk of learning Bible verses. And I would also have leaders that would be underneath me that I would need to make sure we're doing the right thing. They were there on time. And I thought, wow, I don't know if I can do that. But they called me out and said, yes, you can. We see something in you that we think you would be a good Chums leader. Now, if they had never done that, I might still be occasionally working in the nursery or occasionally filling in on a Bible, doing a Bible lesson or something. So that was kind of my personal example of when I was called out to something higher and bigger and dying to myself and giving away all those fears and doing something. So then that was our transition. The second circle there, and I know I need to hurry here, or I'm not going to get through all this, is preparation. So we've been observing people, and we call them out. And then the second step is preparation, which means we need to win their heart. And at this point, Hugh used some sports analogies about having your heart in the game, and I didn't really get all that, but I'm sure some of you guys do. But we Christians as a whole, we don't have a heart for our church or anything church-related. We're weary of hearing about doing things and volunteering for things. And he mentioned that we're just hanging on by a thread of loyalty to our church. So we need to get our heart back into it. We need to give people what they're truly longing for, which is real change, real impact, and a personal transformation. We need to give them a miracle to believe in. Talked about how the disciples walked with Jesus, and they got to watch him do miracles. But they weren't just watching him do miracles, they were participating in it with him. And how that must have just filled their soul to watch, 4,000 or 5,000 people being fed by just loaves and fishes. Or they might have been watching Jesus as he was talking to the woman at the well. And they got to see that. So they were being prepared by watching what was going on there. Well, we want and need the opportunity to get excited about what God is doing, or what's going on and what we can be a part of. So I have another example here. I was at a Bible study, a women's Bible study, and there was a girl that came in. It was her first night there. And I got a chance to talk with her one-on-one, and we prayed together. And she had told me that, she was going through a messy divorce, and her husband had kicked her out of the house and had turned the kids against her, and she was just having a really, really rough time. And before she left that night, I told her, Sandy, I am so excited for you because I can't wait to see what God is going to do in your life. Now, I really felt that and I believed that, but it wasn't until months later that after she had been, back into a good fellowship with God, that she came to me and she said, I still remember what you said to me that first night about how you were excited about what God was going to do. Here I just poured out my heart with all of these awful things that were going on in my life. And you said that you were excited to see what God was going to do, but it gave me hope that things could be different, that things could change, and I could see and be part of a miracle. And that's what we need to give to people today. So then we have another transition. And this one, instead of being a calling out, is a sending out. So after people have observed what's going on, and they're starting to participate a little bit, or prepare a little bit, he said that the sending out was kind of like when you were baptized. It was an outward showing of what was going on in the heart. So the sending out is the same thing. It's an outward showing of you being sent out by God. And he said some ways would be like a time of prayer for people, a laying on of hands. And that sends him into the next part, which is, I have to find it here, participation. The participation has to do with learning and doing. And it's learning to live intuitively, learning to do it just automatically without having to think about it. We need to listen and respond to God's direction, because he's not going to lay it all out in a plan for us and tell us that tomorrow you're going to do this and the next day you're going to meet this person. So we have to learn to listen to God and find out what it is that he wants us to do. Some examples of this is when Jesus left his disciples, he told them to go and do what he had taught them to do. They had to learn to trust. We have to lean on faith and the Holy Spirit. So participation is not just living with no particular goal in mind, except that we're going to be faithful to God in whatever he prompts us to do or tells us to do. And this is where it's a life. It's not a program that you're doing. It's life that you're doing. Our last transition is a commission. And then he said membership, question mark there. But a commission there. This is, you might think at this point that you need a commitment with requirements and expectations, but actually this transition becomes ownership. And if we think back to the apprentice, after he goes through all these steps and he starts out small and he's learning more and he's doing more, then there comes a point when he actually takes ownership of being a carpenter. And I think that's what that transition is to ownership. And then the last step is partnership. And this is when you realize that it's not just about you. It's not just about your growth. It's about growth of others too. And Philippians 1, 4 through 5, I want to read that for you. He says, I always pray for you, and I make my request with a heart full of joy, because you have been my partners in spreading good news about Christ from the time you first heard it until now. And so we're all in a partnership in this, a partnership with each other and a partnership with Christ. At the end of the chapter, I think I had a better understanding of what being spiritual is. It's not doing, but it's being. Is it being a disciple, being an apprentice? But whatever it is, it's real life. That's all I have.